This is the Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Ayoub. In this third season, we will be exploring internationalist solidarity, prefigurative politics, solar punk, and how to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of our times. Each episode will be on one or more of these topics. But before getting into today's topic, I wanted to quickly tell you that you can support this podcast for as little as $2 or $5 a month on patreon.com/firethesetimes. That is patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing it with your friends and families and leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps it get more exposure and introduce it to more folks. That's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I shall explain briefly what we're going to try and do here. I figured I've been doing this pain in the ass PhD for like 7 years now, on and off, part-time. The drama is kind of more well-known than I would have ever wanted it. It's given me very accidentally useful skills to analyze TV series and movies and stuff like that. And to the point that I do think, to the extent that this is accurate, obviously listeners would have to decide. I think the critiques or the different frameworks and stuff like that can be quite interesting to discuss, as they reveal quite a lot about like the world we live in usually. And recently I finished watching Seinfeld, which I was watching with my partner, with my wife. And I wanted to talk about it because I have a thing for sitcoms. I find them fascinating. I rarely love them. I rarely come out of sitcoms saying this was the best thing I've ever seen or whatnot. But when they're well done, or when there's something about them that is insightful, let's put it that way, I end up using them as tools of analysis. I use them as examples to make something that might be more abstract, more relatable, too abstract, more relatable, or whatever. And I grew up watching Friends. That was a huge thing in the house. It was at the time when people still had DVDs. And it was sort of the DVD that, was sort of always there in the background. My sister was addicted to it. I got addicted to it at some point, to the point that my partner thinks my memory of Friends episodes, which I've memorized most of them by heart, is kind of freaky. And I assume it is because my memory is not that amazing usually. But with certain things, I literally rewatched Friends in Spanish because I had known the dialogue so by heart that I was able to associate this is when this what this means and whatnot, and it helped my Spanish. The jokes didn't always translate well, obviously, but this was a real, you can think of it as a cultural touchstone for me. But obviously, and this is what we're going to talk about, because I had a similar experience when it came with Seinfeld. Obviously, Seinfeld coming before Friends, I sort of see where a lot of the Friends stuff came from. But what's kind of interesting, and this is what I want us to get into, is that you obviously have been really into Seinfeld. You're kind of the one who persuaded me to get into it. And at the same time, the way we watch it, I think it's fair to say, is a bit different, or very different, than how maybe other folks watch it, in the sense that in many ways we're not the target audience. Same for Friends, same for pretty much 99% of sitcoms we've ever seen. We're just not the target audience. So I want us to get into that a bit. Talk to us about your relationship with that show. And obviously before doing that, because I'm a very professional podcaster, why don't you introduce yourself, Ayman?
Thank you. No, and I think first of all, hello, thank you. My name is Ayman. I'm a writer from Beirut. I have a degree in screenwriting, so I have some professional insight into some of these things we'll talk about. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, I did grow up watching Seinfeld. And so, you mentioned Friends on DVD, but it was also on TV a lot. Reruns after reruns after reruns, all the time, on just basic cable, because we would have, I don't know if the term basic cable is correct, but we just have a satellite. We'd pay really cheap for it. We'd actually steal it essentially. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up watching a lot, like a lot of people, not just in Lebanon, but in the periphery in general, grew up watching a lot of American sitcoms from the 90s, from the 2000s. So Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Cheers, MASH, According to Jim. this formula of, working class, overweight, white guy with an ostensibly attractive wife with 2.5 kids. I've seen 1,000 versions of those. Some of them the Americans don't know at all, because these are things that didn't sell in America, so they just sold it to,
To us.
yeah, to anybody who would take it. And so Seinfeld was huge for me. And I do love the fact that we'll talk about it, because we're not the target audience. But growing up, my idol was George Costanza.
Mm-hmm.
And now that you've watched the show, you can see how funny that is. Growing
Mm-hmm.
up as I'm not big into identity politics. This isn't necessarily how I identify fully, but as a Druze, queer, Lebanese boy, like growing up in the post-war era or whatever, George Costanza as like a short, insecure, balding, fat, Jewish, whatever guy, not really an idol figure, but I found him so funny. I found him so relatable, and I would emulate him, but quite literally. And yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about, because we're not the target audience, but it was massive for me. I've also memorized quite a lot of Seinfeld, and in retrospect, it's interesting. It's strange that it had such an effect on me, and that yeah, I'm excited to talk a lot about these different aspects of it.
It is, because I will try and do a number of these on different topics, different things I got into growing up and whatnot that I do feel has some kind of resonance with a wider audience. So this could be your friends, your Seinfeld, which is what we're going to do here. I just did one on Star Trek with Jesse Gender. Definitely will do a Harry Potter one, because that was a huge thing growing up, and a Lord of the Rings one as well. But there is something very interesting about not being the target audience. And, in many ways, I can genuinely attribute watching those types of shows. For me, it was Friends, a huge thing. Boy Meets World was a huge thing as well growing up. And then there was, some of the Disney stuff, like That's So Raven, and stuff that honestly I forgot most of it. And other stuff like Home Improvement and some shows like that, yeah, would basically be on TV after I come back from school, essentially. At the same time, shows like Friends and, as I said, Boy Meets World, those in many ways is how I became really good at English,
Yeah,
English
yeah,
language. I was number one in class. English was always this thing I took completely for granted. Like I don't know anything about past, present, participle. I have no idea what this
yeah.
means. I know they exist, but I don't know if you tell me, is this, how to conjugate? I have no idea. It's just completely, it's the only language that I learned that's not my native language, that I learned by complete absorption, basically. And so because of that, there are certain things that I maybe have said, or in the sense that there are certain expressions that I use and whatnot, that I have no idea where they come from, or I didn't think about the contexts. I would have this weird baseball reference, and I've never seen a single baseball match in my life, stuff like that. And Seinfeld is I see now how it's in some sense kind of been the archetype of that genre of TV shows that I ended up associating with why New York is such a familiar sight in my head, and I've never been there. In a way that even London wasn't, because London is another city that's like overrepresented in media, obviously. But I've actually lived in London, and when I went there, there was a bit of familiarity, but I would say not as much as New York, because New York, like in many weird ways, like I would literally know certain addresses, like I would know where this is roughly, and I've never been there. So okay, the being kind of not the recipients of, not the target audience, right? Being cultural consumers, as you said, like even on a global scale, our region for the most part, like 99% of the time, we're not the ones producing mass content, mass culture, mass media, that sort of thing. We're the ones receiving it, we may be like our industries. It's like, I forgot why I read this, but it's like we're into dubbing and subtitling, right, rather than producing. It's kind of changing slightly with like Netflix and stuff, and there are some interesting things happening, of course. But generally speaking, that's still true. Like the massive things that pop up tend to be from the US. From time to time, you have like a Casa de Papel from Spain, or you have like, I don't know, Squid Game from South Korea. You'll have certain things that are from outside of the usual center of that, which is the Anglo duo, like the Americans and the Brits. But not being the target audience also means that there are certain things that I end up kind of identifying with a certain character or a certain trait or even a certain comment or whatever, that can be, weirdly enough, can be damaging in the sense that this is the whole James Baldwin thing. Like, he didn't know he was black until like the age of 4 or 5 or something, and he would watch when he watched it. That's a famous example he's given. I think it was Gary Cooper, like this whole like cowboy shooting Native Americans, and he would identify with the cowboy until at one point he understood that he is actually the Native American, and this metaphor that the movie is trying to push forward or whatnot, this narrative. And obviously, it's not as dramatic in my case when it comes to Friends or Seinfeld, I mean, but a lot of the shows that I did watch, and I think we watched and whatnot, especially post 9/11, post 2003, had, and to many extent still have, lots of not nice portrayal about folks like us.
Yeah.
And I found, and I don't know if we can kind of open up a conversation on this, but I found that I was less not offended. I've never been offended by these things. I've just been maybe bothered or like disgusted or whatever. But when it's overt Islamophobia or even anti-Arab racism, the fact that I did not grow up Muslim and whatnot kind of gives me this cover to, when I was younger, I mean, to tell, oh, they're not actually talking about me. This isn't about me, as a protection.
Yeah.
But when there are shows like in Lost or in Community, where they're actually trying to have a positive Arab character, but the character isn't an Arab, or at the very least doesn't even speak Arabic. In both cases, I believe, were Indians, the ones I mentioned. The bad Arabic that is spoken, the fact that it's clearly not good Arabic, it's like Fusha, which is like modern standard Arabic, but like not really spoken very well, and no one actually talks this way anyway. That tells me something that is kind of more, I don't know if the term is hurtful, but more painful to kind of absorb or to internalize than the, as I said, overt racist portrayals. Because overt racist portrayals, well, those are racist pieces of shit. Like, fuck them. I don't have to spend too much time thinking about them. I just need to oppose them, and I think this is shit. But when they try and do something quote unquote good, and they clearly don't put the effort, the research effort, into just making it basically okay. And that's the same thing of like how so many of those TV shows and movies have Arabic written, you know, from left to right, and the letters are broken and stuff like that. It just tells me that literally we don't matter. Like, quite literally, it does not matter whatsoever if at any point we find this bad or like insulting or whatever, because we're not the target audience. At the same time, those various shows, of course, the main target audience tend to be Americans and whatever, but they get exported because that's the nature of business. And we end up consuming them. And in many ways, more of us consume them than Americans consume them or Brits consume them. Certainly in the case for Brits, most British TV shows, non-Brits are, you know, more numerical, like we say, more numerous, sorry, than Brits. And for many American shows as well, Casa de Papel, same thing and whatnot. And so that creates a sort of like, oh, you have the American friends, the US friends, the US audience friends with like all of the internal contradictions, the transphobia, the homophobia, the misogyny, the classist stuff, all of that stuff, same for Seinfeld. But then when it translates, right, or it crosses a border, we might miss some of that nuance, basically. We might miss like, oh, actually, yeah, this was transphobic in season 1 and or whatever. And certainly the racist stuff as well, because it tends to be US focused and all of that stuff. So what does, talk to us a bit about your relationship with Seinfeld, given that, because obviously we've been talking about it on and off for like months now. How do you sort of relate to it?
Well, so yeah, everything you said, I definitely relate with. And I think something that's really important to mention, because time feels really weird these days. We're talking about a time before YouTube and social media. So like genuinely everything that was on TV, that was it. We really didn't have much else to go by. So like these mass media productions are the main things we're consuming. And genuinely that was my experience, that I grew up watching these shows and identifying with these characters. And essentially, I mean, if James Baldwin was saying that, you know, it wasn't, I mean, his experience of racialization is much more immediate, being, you know, an African American. But I genuinely thought that I was white. I thought I was an American until I went to the US. And then I realized, like, holy shit, I have no idea who these people are. who the hell is Jessica and Bradley. But yeah, growing up, I would watch things like Family Guy. And I was so obsessed with understanding every single reference, every single time they brought up I don't know, some show from the 50s or something from the 80s or whatever. And so, I mean, the same thing for me. I mean, my accent is quite American. I did grow up in an international school, and so I had some like American teachers, but still, compared to most of my classmates, I still developed a stronger American accent. Um, because of my affinity for these things, and I really thought that I was just, in Lebanon in like an incubator, but the things that I really identify with are all these characters I'm seeing on TV, and also as like a closeted queer person, and seeing these sort of like, oh, that's a place that I can go and be myself. But yeah, obviously with all the problematic natures of these things, I really picked them up. And so aside from having fluent and perfect English or whatever, there are phrases that I'm only now discovering are really funny because my, Austrian husband doesn't understand them. Oh, you're a chip off the old block, or, oh, that's no skin off my teeth. I don't know, just random
There's
shit.
so many baseball references.
Yeah. First base, second base, like the concept of that, and Joe DiMaggio, I don't know. So there was definitely that. And for me, the first time I really reckoned with that, I think, was with reading Edward Said, because he talks about the Lone Ranger and Tonto, and that because the main character, the text of it is you identify with the Lone Ranger. But he, as a Palestinian, discovered that he has much more in common, actually, with the fate of Tonto, with this Native American, with this indigenous American.
Yeah.
And so for me, there was a lot of that dissonance growing up. There was a clear, I think I remember watching The Hurt Locker when it came out and finding myself kind of offended because that's pretty immediate,
Yeah.
But I could overlook a lot of the Arab phobia, a lot of the racism and the Islamophobia in Family Guy and whatever, because it's like, yeah. And again, this is a time of the war on terror. This is a time when it really wasn't cool to be Arab at all, and or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, and as Lebanese, and as whatever, and as a light-skinned person, there's like sort of so much distance from it. I'm not that type of Arab, or whatever. Until I discovered that they do not have that distinction.
Yeah.
This is our distinction that we're trying to do to protect ourselves from whatever. So, yeah, I love this. I love thinking about Boy Meets World and sitcoms and all these things. Seinfeld in specific, let's get into it.
Yes.
Because Seinfeld for me is distinct from all these shows because it's obviously got a lot to do with all these things, but there's also a way of living that I generally still go by, that I really love, which is this very like minimalist sort of way of being with friends, with each other, in a way that's, how do I describe it? Okay, do you remember the episode of the...
It kind of feels a bit like how we relate to friends in Lebanon. Like, yeah, which episode was it?
No, so that's the thing. It's like, my favorite thing of all time and how I spent most of my time in Beirut was going to cafes and just sitting and talking.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I know that sounds a bit more like Friends, but Friends, there's like events, there's things that are happening, there's love relations between them. Yeah, but with Seinfeld, quite genuinely, it's the emphasis on the things that are happening between the things that are happening, right? It's this sort of nothingness. It's funnily called the show about nothing, although it does have an actual premise. I don't know if you know, it is actually like the idea is the show is about how a comedian comes up with his material, So that episode of the Chinese restaurant for me is quite genius. They're waiting on a table and the 20 minutes is just them fucking around. It's just them having fun with each other, talking, making jokes, doing what's called, hey, I bet you, I'll give you $50 if you go and take a spring roll from that table. I love that shit. And even from such a distant experience as mine, And even still today, actually, with all the trauma and with all the bullshit that's happened in the last few years, genuinely, this is something that I still hold true, which is we really do not have much that's tangible in our lives except for the people around us and our friends and our family. And it reminds me of a poem that's in this Swedish film called Songs from the Second Floor. Forget what the poem is called, but one of the lines is it's taken from the Sermon on the Mount, and it's a sort of subversion of it. And the line is, "Blessed is he who sits down." And this is my favorite thing: sitting down. And this is why I hated London and why I do love Vienna and I miss Beirut. Is just that sitting down in a cafe, we've got nothing. You know, we're all gonna die. There's nothing really that's urgent. I mean, there is, but like, let's just sit down for 2-3 hours and talk shit, you know, and talk philosophy, talk politics, talk whatever. Ultimately, it's meaningless. And there is a kind of existentialism to the show, to that kind of thing, but also a sincerity. So sitting down, being present, just having fun with each other. Like there is no real, there's nothing we can really resolve or fix. And this is why I love psychoanalysis. This is why I love like discussion. This is why I love, and it's just fun. Having fun with each other with nothing really in our hands except that our minds and our like attachment to each other. And it's very rare to find. I do have friends who I can do this with, where I can just pick up the phone and just instantly start having this back and forth of like, why don't you call me anymore? You know, it's like, what do you mean? I called you last week. He was like, yeah, you missed called me. That wasn't an actual call. And then the back and forth. That's something that I generally, there's one phrase in the early seasons of Seinfeld that I still use constantly, which is when Jerry wants to go do his laundry. And George is like, I don't want to go do your laundry with you. And Jerry's like, come on, be a come with guy. A come with guy. I love it. And genuinely the closest people in my life are these people who are just more than happy to just come with you. Because whatever, I'm going to do laundry. But the important thing is we're together. We're talking. We're having fun. We don't have to go and do something and watch an opera or whatever. And even then, when they go watch an opera, the fun bits are when they're standing in line, you know? So Seinfeld, in that very specific way, is something for me that I still actually live by. The sort of emphasis on relationships, on talking, on the quirkiness of whatever, you know? It's having fun with each other. There's not really any plot, because the plot is the less interesting thing, you know?
It is. And the best episodes, I mean, those that are most memorable, even like I've watched Seinfeld once. The most memorable ones are the parking lot one and the contest and, stuff where basically, yeah, again, it is about nothing, but it is about what happens during that nothing, right? Like I did a literal entire episode with a historian, Susan Crane, who wrote a book called The History of Nothing.
Yeah.
And it's like the book is fantastic. It's literally about like, what do we even mean when we say nothing? Like nothing happened, or nothing's going on here, or this is about nothing, or like I'm literally doing nothing. How the fuck can you be doing nothing? That's literally not possible. What I've been finding really interesting recently, like thinking about all of these shows and even movies and whatnot, is that the things that kind of you relate to, and this is I think it's a universal thing. That's why the American shows that do this very well, or the British ones as well, I think do translate in that sense, is the whole hanging out. I mean, that's the power. That's Friends, right? Friends, the entire thing of Friends is that they have all of these different backgrounds and, I mean, different, they're all white, but in the sense that, they have different jobs and whatnot, and some of them are kind of more middle class and others more working class, like Phoebe compared to Ross or whatever. But really, ultimately, like, 80% of the time they're just sitting on the couch in Central Perk, that cafe.
Yeah.
And I find this fascinating because there is a cafe in Brumana in Lebanon called Unicorn Cafe that is literally modeled after Central Perk. The couch is there, that sort of thing. And that's where because it's next to my house, that's where I would go. That's why I wrote my proposal to do the master's in London, That's why I did a lot of just my writing because I just enjoyed being there. I didn't quite like. I don't know if they listen to this, but some of the decor is tacky. Like it is kind of just transplanted. It kind of feels, but the idea is nice. I like that idea. I actually think there's no need to copy paste Friends because Lebanon is entirely like most of the cafes are already doing that. That's kind of already a thing. I've been thinking a lot, and that's why I want to do a number of these episodes. That when I think of like Harry Potter and how I grew up on these books, the main things that I remember aren't even the actions and them breaking out of a bank and killing the Dark Lord and spoilers, I guess, whatever, and stuff like that. It's when they're hanging out. They're hanging out around the table in the mess hall, whatever it's called. They're hanging out in Gryffindor, common room. They're hanging out at Hagrid's. That's a huge thing, right? All of those things, or even in Lord of the Rings, which is like 80% adventures. The most memorable stuff for me are like they're chilling at the pub in the Shire, stuff like that. Like basically when there isn't that action, because if you only have that action, then you have those movies that are all about like adrenaline pumps. They're very meaningless for the most part. You kind of watch it once, you've already forgotten it by the time you're done, and it doesn't kind of stick in that sense. But all of these shows, Seinfeld being one of them, because Seinfeld is like, because there is Seinfeld the movie, and there's the character in the movie, and then there is the actor playing that character, who is obviously named Jerry Seinfeld, and then there is the real Seinfeld who has lived during Seinfeld, the show, and since Seinfeld. And you can sort of see even that disconnect in many ways. And the fact that at the end of the day, many of the jokes that he was making during the whole stand-up at the beginning of episodes were genuinely not funny. No. Like, were just not smart. And it's like 80% of the time is, haha, like that working person, isn't he stupid? It's like stuff like that. And so that's completely unrelatable to me. But then the absurdity of Kramer and George and Elaine and all of the relationship between them and how that even works, no one even knows, because like, do they even respect one another? It's not even clear, but it's one of those things where it kind of works. And that element of, I just literally finished watching The Good Place now, like 2 hours ago. The Good Place. It's on Netflix. It's also 4 different characters and they end up being very close and all of that stuff. I like the idea of different backgrounds, different whatnot, as cheesy as it is, and sometimes it is simplistic, sometimes it is problematic. I like the premise of that it is possible to come from different backgrounds and somehow to transcend all of that. I do think this matters. Now, that being said, there's something in most of these shows, honestly. The Office comes to mind as well. I will try and do a specific thing about The Office because I got quite obsessed with it like a couple of years ago, the US one. Yeah. Because The Office, what's fascinating about it is that The Office doesn't matter. Like literally their job is pointless and they all know it's pointless. The director is kind of a moron, like everyone knows this, and he's kind of the butt of the joke. I do think it's problematic how in the US version compared to the British version, as much as Ricky Gervais is an annoying douchebag, but in the US version, there's a kind of a redemptive narrative around the boss. And that's a very American thing. The boss is almost always towards the end someone redeemable. And those class hierarchies especially end up becoming, it's fine if you're a multimillionaire and you're just a worker. We're all humans in the end, but like we don't do anything about the fact that there's a multimillionaire and a worker, stuff like that. But it's very interesting to me that because we know like there's actual research on the matter that The Office became super popular in the early days of the pandemic, basically when offices were closed. I just listened to this episode of Seriously Wrong, which is a fantastic podcast. I would try and get that guest actually on because she was talking about The Office a lot. But she mentioned as like in, I think 2021 or 2020, there was 50 billion hours of The Office watched, streamed, or like an incredibly huge amount of time watched. And that's very interesting because the thing about The Office is, okay, it's this thing that in 2020 we lost, like most folks can't go back to the office and stuff like that, those who did go to the office. But really it's the fact that they were all hanging out. Like, again, 90% of what they do, although it's a paper-making company, whatever, they do nothing related to paper. Not 19% of the time. It's tanks, it's pointless meetings, it's jokes, it's whatnot, it's meeting your soulmate and becoming best friends with your former enemy and, stuff like that. And that's very interesting to me because some of it feels intentional, like an anti-work ethic, which I am genuinely really into. And some of it feels accidental. And when it feels accidental, it's almost like, that meme of Republicans or in the US or conservatives almost getting something right and then missing the point. Like saying something like, if we cancel debt to all students, that means, I don't know, they won't work as, I don't know, something like that. And then in the replies, you'll have something like, yeah, that's the point. It's like they don't get the thing that they're threatened by, essentially.
It's a page called like conservatives accidentally proving communism or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. So I find that interesting. Like just those contradictions is what I find interesting in TV series, because it's consumable, right? Like that's the point of those sitcoms. Like the episodes have to be enjoyable. Like there has to be it has to kind of end on some kind of note that makes you want to watch more and whatnot. But during those 20 or 40 minutes, it also have to keep they have to keep your attention going, right? They have to keep your focus on the show. So with all of this said, how watching it the third time, fourth time, that's not really what does it. What does it is, when do I watch? Like, did I rewatch it 5 years later, 10 years later, stuff like that? Because so much happens in the meantime. You're a different person and all of that stuff. But also, probably you've read more on it. Maybe there's like some more nuance you've missed at the first time, that second time you catch it or whatnot. So did that happen to you when it came to Seinfeld?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there, actually. Because, first of all, I love The Office. And through The Office, I do have a lot of like comparative analysis with the British and the American, because I do love British shows, and British TV has very different motives and styles and whatever.
I made a note that I want us to get into US British stuff, because that's fascinating, but let's spin this for now.
So mainly the fact that the British Office is 2 seasons, 6 episodes a season, and that is the norm. Most British shows, it's a season is 6 episodes, and they run for 2 seasons, right? And this is Fawlty Towers, this is Peep Show, even though it runs for longer, but it's 6 episode seasons and usually 2. And the British Office, spoilers for those that haven't watched it, is fucking depressing.
Yeah.
It is like social realism. It is more like just, there's so much more like sounds of the fax machines, boring. This existentialist dread of office life is much more present. You have Dawn, the character who is essentially Pam, saying, I don't want to wake up one morning and realizing that, 5 years have gone by. And I'd rather be, or I think they do bring this up, I'd rather be halfway up a ladder, or at the bottom of a ladder I want to get up, rather than half away of a ladder I don't want to. And in the end, they all lose. Tim doesn't get with, what's it called? Ricky Gervais, the boss, gets fired in a very depressing scene. Where he's humanized, and it's just this moment where it's like, please don't do this. It's so depressing. And that's it. And there's not going to be a reunion. There's not going to be an SNL short where it's The Office, but in Japan. That exists, by the way. It's kind of racist, but it's kind of funny. But anyway, and that is something that's kind of unique with American capitalist productions of this. It's never ending, right? Mm-hmm. And so a good example is The Simpsons, which I highly recommend. There's a video essay by, he used to be called Cuck Philosophy. He's called like Jake something Philosophy now. He's not right wing. Cuck is like a 18th century philosopher term for domination. But anyway, about zombie Simpsons. It's on its 30th season. And The Simpsons originally was a show criticizing American culturalist, consumerist, media stuff, like it's become a caricature of itself. If you remember early Simpsons, there was a lot of jokes about Krusty the Clown, right? There's a Krusty the Clown cup. There's a Krusty the Clown doll that tries to kill everybody. It's made of lead paint. And now there are the same things, but for Bart Simpson. And if you watch it, it's completely unfamiliar, because the point of the show is that there's just more and more and more and more. This brings me back to this idea of the laugh track, right? A lot of people have theories about why are laugh tracks so popular, so present. Some people think that it allows you to know when a joke lands, when you're meant to laugh. A good example, I don't know if you've ever seen like Friends, like a scene of Friends where they've removed
Without
the
it, yeah,
laugh
yeah. When they remove it, yeah.
It's quite cringe. It's quite
Yeah,
painful. Like, that's not
yeah,
funny. I think a part of the reason that the laugh track is so popular isn't necessarily that, it makes bad material good, but it connects to the same concept of why there's, 180 episodes of Friends and why we keep coming back to it. It's because it really gives you the sense of being a part of a community, being surrounded by people. And these shows are designed for people who've come back home from work, who don't want to think about anything, who just want to kind of pass time while they're eating dinner, whatever. It's not meant to engage you critically or radicalize you or anything. It is meant to pacify. It is meant to just be this kind of thing that you can infinitely consume. And so that laugh track assists with that. It's just this feeling that you're not alone in your apartment. And again, it supplements this kind of model of the American work life. And it can kind of give you a bit of this feeling of being with friends, and literally the name of friends, because the name of the friends isn't that they're friends, but they're your friends. You feel close to Joey. Sorry. I forgot that anyway, you feel close to Phoebe, you feel close to Chandler, this person, And so with Seinfeld, it's the same thing. I feel very close to these characters and familiar. And I do want to mention, because I don't want to discuss Seinfeld without mentioning this. Jerry Seinfeld is a piece of shit, right? Larry David is a piece of shit. He's a sexist. He's a misogynist. He's a classist. Larry David's a multimillionaire now, right? And so,
and Jerry Seinfeld, I think, is the most paid comedian, or like in the top 5. It's he's multi-hundred million or whatever. Like, it's ridiculous.
But his stand-up is sexist as fuck. It's super heteronormative. And what I find myself doing when watching it, rewatching it, I just skip the stand-up.
It's just dumb. Yeah.
It's just dumb. But then that brings up what you were mentioning earlier, which is, how do I still can watch it, especially as a queer person, especially as an anti-Zionist, and like, they do have jokes, they do have Islamophobic jokes, they do have it's explicitly apolitical, but in that it gets very political. And so then we start talking about that sort of like distinction between the artist and the art, right? And for me, that's been a big issue, specifically with these things I grew up with when I was essentially much more mentally colonized. And so Bob Dylan is another example. And I still really love Bob Dylan. I still listen to him all the time. But he is also a really hardcore Zionist, Mm-hmm. He wrote a song called Neighborhood Bully, where he satirically or like sardonically talks about, his neighbors want to kill him, and he's the neighborhood bully,
Mm-hmm.
And then literally all these myths of he turned the desert into a castle or whatever. It's like, fuck. So it is difficult, but I think it definitely does bring up a lot of need for community. And then when we grew up with these things, the distinction between the art and the artist is definitely something that I know you deal with, and we'll talk about more with Harry Potter, because J.K. Rowling is a turf, horrible person who just has like a literal obsession.
She's literally obsessed. Like, it's like bizarre.
It's scary. Have you heard about her new book?
Yeah. I know. And there's a trans character in it who's like something bad. Like, it's
a murderer. It's the initial transphobic and homophobic myth of the duplicitous, person who is pretending to be whatever just so they can get into women's spaces. And there's like this 1950s infomercial, careful, that man may be a homosexual murderer. And so anyway, I think one thing actually that I will talk about as well, which is this connection between the British and the American stuff. The American, and I find this super interesting, and this is something that is discussed in this video essay by this philosophy guy, which is the return to the status quo.
Yeah.
Right? Which is everything is resolved at the end of the episode, and then we get back, and it's, we're back to square one. And so it's fine. Don't worry about it. No matter how bad things will get, we go back to the next episode, and it's fine. Friends breaks that a little bit in terms of there is the Rachel Ross thing, there's the Chandler Monica thing. Like it does sort of, there's a serial. Fun fact, in screenwriting terms or in like filmmaking terms, there's a distinction between series and serials. So series are like Cheers, like Simpsons, and like Seinfeld. Nothing changes. Every episode is what's called in a serial. It's like Lost. You do have to watch every episode. And so Friends was interesting because it included a bit of a serial element, but mostly at the end of the season.
Yeah.
But so that return to the status quo is very reactionary, because essentially it's like things are fine. It's just these like minor contrivances that get in the way. But ultimately, when we go back to the norm, things are okay. And this is why The Simpsons was super like radical in a way, because the status quo wasn't quo. It wasn't good. You had an abusive, alcoholic, stupid father figure. You had a corrupt mayor. You had a billionaire, whatever. Like, it's ingrained into the show that the status quo is not quo. But for the most part, like, things are fine. And it's just nice. It's just, and I can rewatch The Office. I rewatch it all the time. And I find it so fascinating that during the pandemic, it wasn't whatever. My husband can't watch it because he's like, I'm in the office all day. Why would I want to come home and watch more of The Office?
That's the thing, because that's how it became popular. It became popular because lots of folks will go to the office and then go back home and watch The Office. And there is something very dystopian about that as well. Like, at the end of the day, there's this, I did this episode with Sharia Talirani on prison literature and focusing on Syria. And actually, was it in that episode? No, it was the episode with Daniel Kurd on authoritarianism, Palestine, Qatar, all of that stuff. And there is this concept of tenfis. Tenfis is very interesting for those who don't know. It's literally like letting the air out, right? Like from a balloon or whatever. And the idea is that Arab authoritarian regimes especially would allow certain flexibilities from time to time to sort of allow folks to let off steam. A lot of activists, writers, they would allow like a book salon, that sort of thing. And very specific topics that are otherwise considered subversive or whatever would be tolerated for a certain period of time in certain contexts in a limited way and that sort of thing. And the idea is that it's tenfis. Now, the kind of flip side of tenfis is that you can sort of see it in a bit cynical way, like, clearly nothing matters if even they have incorporated. It's like the whole like a corporation incorporating anti-capitalist ethics because it sells well, that ridiculous Pepsi commercial, that sort of thing. But the thing about tenfis is that sometimes it gets out of hand. Like, they would allow certain things to happen. Like, they would allow a pro-Palestine march in Damascus, 20 years ago, which was very rare, but from time to time, or one in Cairo or whatever. And sometimes it sort of gets out of hand because that, in many cases, that's what the episode with Dana was. Like, with many folks, that pro-Palestine march in Qatar, let's say, or pro-Palestine activism in general in Qatar, would be the first and sometimes only politicization experience that, let's say, a Qatari may have. I'm simplifying a bit, but that tends sometimes to be the case. And what's interesting about this concept in the context of what we're talking about is that this is why I find it very fascinating that even when they are trying to satirize The Office, let's say in The Office, they're sort of not entirely able to escape it either. Like, at the end of the day, minor spoilers, although honestly, even if you know how The Office ends, it's still funny to watch it. The US one I'm talking. It sort of doesn't matter who becomes boss because that was like an entire thing. And when two of the main characters want to leave, the boss who becomes the boss, he's not fake, but he actually fires them. And the reason why he fires them is so that they can get a severance package. Like, the boss is complicit with the employees against the system that makes him the boss in the first place. It's this weird kind of critique that sort of kind of works, but also doesn't. It's both at the same time, because obviously the critique there is that, well, if this is a pointless job, why are we still in it?
Yeah.
But that's the case, and we have this internal tension being resolved internally, and so because it's resolved internally, you don't need to think about it too much. It's the whole Jim and Pam thing. Jim, he hates his job. He considers it pointless. He says it's ridiculous and it's dumb. So he spends most of his time doing pranks and whatever. But kind of towards the end, the lesson there isn't that this was actually a soul-sucking job that should have never existed because it's pointless. It's that actually, if you kind of stick it out, long enough, you'll find your soulmate, and you'll find your best friend, and you'll be the best man at your former nemesis's wedding, and you'll, stuff like that. And that for me is both very interesting / potentially powerful, and also very depressing at the same time, like the two at the same time. And it's those contradictions that I do think works best in shows like this, because they have to sell you, or they have to transmit, or whatever, some kind of emancipatory thing, because it's very difficult to sit through something for a very long period of time, especially if you need to commit to like seasons. If you know that it's not going to end well, it's all depressing, it's all pointless, it's all whatever. And even in the depressing stuff like BoJack Horseman, there is some kind of element of it that's kind of emancipatory, in the sense that we understand that, wait, if it's pointless to be a billionaire, what's the point of the capitalist system? There are these ways you can kind of take those critiques that sometimes even in the show itself are not pursued. And this sort of takes me to this other aspect of, that's why I'm sort of like, I still read articles being very critical of shows like Friends, like Seinfeld, like especially stuff, let's say, written in recent years, like literally past 5 years or so. I would still read them because like I'm sort of curious and I'm interested to see the arguments. But I tend not to like too much the accusatory tone that sometimes, not always, but like sometimes are embedded in those pieces, because it's often like, this is why this is a racist show, this is why this is a transphobic show. And fine, you can watch it if you want, but just be honest with yourself. And I don't think this maybe, okay, to take two different roads here, and one of whom will kind of not pursue as much. Like there is an American writing about an American show to an American audience. So that's not what I'm reading, because I'm not an American audience. I'm not part of that audience. But I do think that even if something is very problematic that is part of you, especially if you kind of consumed it growing up, it might hurt more to just suddenly ignore that aspect of your life and say, like, I'm just gonna exit, I'm just not gonna think about it anymore, because there is potential for growth. And this brings me to Harry Potter. Because Harry Potter, for me, I sent you a voice note yesterday. I can honestly describe it in a way that Lord of the Rings wasn't, because Lord of the Rings was this other big thing growing up, but it was escaping into a fantasy land. Like I didn't want to be the king or the Shire folk or the, whatever. It's like, I'm escaping, it's fun to watch, and those are interesting characters and whatever. But with Harry Potter, in many ways, this was my proto-activism ideas, in many ways, like Hermione defending the rights of house elves, and the fighting literally a literal white supremacist figure like the Dark Lord, and the whole Muggles versus wizards, and if you have Muggle parents and all of that stuff. Now, after some time, this is literally 20 years ago when I started reading it, 2003 or so. Maybe, around that time, 2003, 2004, I think, if I have my dates right. Later, like in the past decade or so, I've read more interesting critiques about Harry Potter. I didn't pay attention too much to the goblins and how they're quite literally like anti-Semitic tropes in those in the banks, in Gringotts banks, and how you shouldn't trust them, and and stuff like that, and other characters that are like tokenized minorities and stuff like that. And I still take that in. But what happens now is that when I watch those movies, especially the movies, because it's a visual thing, right? Because when you're reading, you can kind of ignore certain thing and interpret it in a different way and kind of make it your own. But when you're watching, it's like there's that bit, or you see the goblins, and now that this is clearly an anti-Semitic trope. I just sort of wait for that scene to end. Like I just think this is not nice. This is pointless. Let's move that, like, or not push it aside, but like, let's skip, so to speak, not literally. I just wait for it to end, and now let's enjoy the rest of the film, the bits that I do enjoy, right? And I do think that thing is interesting. Like, it's interesting to have gotten to the point where you're almost catering what you want to get out of that film or that movie or that series. And I'm not saying that's completely problematic free. I don't think that's the case. I think it's problematic, but I think it's interesting. And I think it's worth it, let's say, to kind of hold that tension and hold that contradiction and to try to understand why you were into it in the first place, not coming from a site of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
So like, oh, you're a bad person because you enjoyed Friends. Like, I don't care for that. I don't think it's very meaningful. So anyway, how do you, again, because Seinfeld, as we mentioned before, the guy himself is a douchebag. The actor who played Kramer said like racist shit like 10 years or 20 years ago or whatever. Because also, you know that you're not the target audience, as we started saying in the beginning of this conversation. How do you hold that tension? And the bits that are offensive, let's put it that way, what do you sort of do with them?
Well, it is really interesting. So, like, for instance, for the stand-up, I just skip it. But what I find myself thinking a lot about is, I mean, I do think about that tension a lot. And sometimes, when I grew up watching Seinfeld, the thing to do, if you liked Seinfeld, because the big things were Seinfeld and Friends, is to be contemptuous of people that watch Friends.
Yes, I did know this. Yeah.
So it's just, and we're the cooler people that like the smarter humor or the more interesting whatever. Friends watchers are normies, whereas we're the kind of like eccentric whatever. But no, it's true. And I think there's like a debate me bro kind of atmosphere to being like, why do you like Friends? Like, oh, have you seen it without a soundtrack, like without a laugh track? But no, the truth is this holds a lot of this. People across the world hold these characters dearly. Like you were mentioning, it's big in Japan. It's big in Lebanon.
Friends is huge in Japan. It's like a thing. It's just a huge thing.
I have my cousins as well. I have like an obsession with Friends. Like I've seen them play like a Friends trivia game where it's like, what's the comeback that Joey made to Phoebe in that? And I was like,
I would ace those quizzes completely. Like as I said, I've memorized entire episodes, and it's like, I'll stop on that, but like, it's how in many ways I related with my sister at one point, like because again, the DVDs were hers. So when she put them, I would ask her, and it just became a thing, it just became a entirely customizable or customized experience that went beyond the initial intention of the writers of that show. Yeah.
No, for sure. And then where I see a lot of like fruitful analysis and place for understanding, since it's just a matter of fact, we grew up with these things. We didn't have much else. This is a big component of our lives. But growing up, knowing now that this wasn't intended for us, but actually these characters would have like, don't know anything about us. And so my experience, I grew up in an international school. It was like an American school. And so the thing to do was to go to the US for school, right, for university. And I was going to go to New York, to like upstate New York, which I didn't know was that different from New York City. So I did actually spend a bit of time in New York City, like a couple of weeks before I went upstate. Well, first of all, I couldn't handle it. It was a terrifying experience. I had a really, really intense, crippling agoraphobia. Quite literally, I was just throwing up all the time because I was just terrified of people. It was also unfamiliar in reality. People are just big. They're just large humans in New York City. They're just 7 feet tall. At least I felt. When I went, I literally did do the Seinfeld thing. I saw the outside of the cafe. The outside shot. I saw that place. I had a black and white cookie. You remember that episode? I had an Entenmann's donuts. Literally, there's just a tiny bit where Elaine is eating Entenmann's donuts. And I went to a Walmart and I bought it. And whenever I tell American people that I had that, they're like, what the fuck are you talking about? But because it's just like donuts in a bag. but it was terrifying. And so there's that big dissonance in my life where growing up, I really thought that I was one of these people. And then I went to the US and I just discovered I'm absolutely not. And they know nothing about me. When I told people I was from Lebanon, they literally, like, it's not a joke, thought I meant Arizona, because it was just so unfathomable that something like Lebanon exists. Anyway, I like saying this because growing up watching Seinfeld, watching all these shows, when I went to the US, I was expecting that I would have a Seinfeld-esque experience. But in fact, I had an experience much more akin to a Tom and Jerry episode where Jerry leaves Tom. And it's a very, like, philosophical episode because essentially these are antagonistic characters. And so Jerry leaves. He writes him a note like, I'm going to the Big Apple. And Jerry, the mouse, goes to the big city and he's just massive buildings, massive people. And, you know, he gets completely destroyed by the city. He ends up getting like knocked onto a hot dog and like flows into the gutter. Genuinely, that was my experience. I'm like a short Arab, whatever, but just like, oh my God, this massive city. And I thought it would eat me alive. And so there's that feeling of also something that I find very interesting that I know F.A. Levant talks a lot about, that I think they deal with in the Mangal Media. I think it's written in the manifesto, which is, as people in the periphery, we all consume these things. And so then we relate to one another through these, you know, oh, you're such a Monica.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But we're using literally things from hegemonic cultural imperialist centers to relate to one another, and then it distance ourselves from ourselves and from each other, because obviously you're not a Rachel. You know, you didn't grow up in this in the U.S. and whatever, and went to this Ivy League school or whatever. And so, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily helpful to be dismissive, but rather to examine, like, what parts of it are still in me, what parts of it is it fine to still appreciate. I think there are some bits of Seinfeld, you know, when he's reaching into George opens up the trash can and sees an eclair.
Yes.
One bite, it's in the trash, but there's only one bite, and it's on a bunch of magazines. So he decides, you know what, fuck it. I fucking love eclairs, you know, and he goes and eats it. And his girlfriend's like mom sees him. And then it's the whole bit afterwards of like justifying with his friends. They were like, you know, wait, it was in the trash? You ate trash. And like, no, Jerry, it was above the rim. You know, it wasn't in it. And they're like, what else was in the trash can? Just magazines. And it had a bite in it? Yeah, but I saw who took the bite. You know, I kissed her hello, so it's fine. Like, those things I still think I can relate to and I love. And, you know, it's the kind of things I see myself in that. And I think that's fine. I am still stuck with this distinction between the art and the artist. Like, I definitely won't give Seinfeld money, but, you know, and like buy his whatever, I'll stream or whatever, or I'll download. The same thing with J.K. Rowling, like you wouldn't purchase any of the new stuff or the games. But then I think that still limits ourselves to this idea that all we are consumerists and that like our dollars or whatever. Like, aside from that, I think a better example, because at the time I was really into Woody Allen as well. And it's that same kind of like neurotic, you know, you know, kind of self-deprecating humor. That's a much more real example in terms of like the guy is literally a pedophile, like abuser. Mm-hmm. And so even talking about him, it still is difficult. I definitely don't have any conclusions of how to hold those tensions, and ethically, you know, or to do it in But I will say one thing. Mm-hmm. This is an important thing to mention within this whole sphere, is that as a closeted queer, as someone who was afraid to come out, as someone who was like not even afraid to come out, who was like homophobic, you know, was actively against and whatever, because I think in retrospect afraid of what it would mean if I were to come out. Mm-hmm. My big representation on TV, again, there's no social media, no YouTube, no whatever, I couldn't even talk to people because I didn't know anybody and whatever. Was Will and Grace, right? Was Sex and the City. Were these very white, liberal portrayals of like gay cis men, and this is all I had. I say this is all I had. It's not true, because the alternatives were the things on Lebanese TV, namely Mejdi Wejdi, which is just openly, disgustingly homophobic and transphobic and whatever. So it's like between those two poles, this is what I think a lot of us grew up in. And I think Mejdi Wejdi is not just that it's like actively toxic and shitty and whatever. It's just bad. It's just badly written. And that was like a lot of the Lebanese TV we grew up in as well. Like, it's just not well written, not well produced. Obviously, there are economic and like colonial factors as to why our cultural industries are not allowed to grow. Whereas the cultural centers and the are the economic centers, I bring this up as well because Lucas, my husband, grew up watching German TV and Austrian TV in a protected environment. There was no ability for the American market to penetrate into it, whereas we grew up in the free market, wild, wild west, And so there's so much problematic. Like, that's like growing up, like thinking, oh, I'm more like Will than Jack, Jack, the more flamboyant, hey, kind of gay, and me thinking, no, I'm not like that. I'm more like, straight kind of like, because Will passes as a straight man, right? He's a lawyer, he's fine, he's whatever, he's a functioning member of capitalist society, but he's also gay. So it's like, it's fine. You can still be Joe Schmo and also love men. And so between these two poles, I was identifying with this one, but I'm identifying with a man who has nothing in common with me, who then in real life, when I went and met, and now with a lot of the white gay men that I've met, cis men, I can't relate to them at all. I feel very alien by them. So I think there's something really interesting that we do have a lot to examine about these things that are very real within us, that we've grown up with these things. This is how we learn to identify, how we saw ourselves and saw our society. And then that disconnect when we discover that that's not true. And then the further disconnect when we discover that this is the like cultural empire that is also deeply, deeply Islamophobic, Arab-phobic, queer-phobic, and whatever, that will only assimilate and include some queer character, some whatever, as long as it's, they're kind of, what's the word, defanged.
Like tokenized as well. Like,
you'll only have now some bits of like Rami, for instance. So it's a show that's like openly anti-Zionist, openly anti-Islamophobic, anti-whatever. But...
So I don't think there is necessarily a way to resolve those tensions. I think like just by the definition of how they function or how they operate, they're sort of always open-ended. And at some point it's like you don't really resolve it. You just kind of move beyond it, or like you put it aside because you're doing something else now or whatever. You're thinking about something else. But like I genuinely think one of the reasons why I honestly never, although I grew up in Lebanon in a very close environment or whatever, I had no opinions whatsoever about or let's put it that way, I never had anything that would connect me to like a homophobic tendency. It was just not there, and there was just nothing in my personal, like it's literally like before even thinking about the rights and diversity and all of that stuff, my instinct was more, why should I give a shit? It's someone else, like someone else's life. It's very basic like that. And so that's why a lot of the outrage that, again, this whole proto-activism came from, like, stop bothering them. This instinct of just leave them alone. Because I understood later, I grew up autistic and I didn't know it. I wanted to be left alone a lot. And not quite literally as in, sometimes literally, but sometimes just in the sense of there are so many of these things that it's needlessly complicated. Like, that's how I would approach it. Like, this is needlessly complicated. It can be simplified. And so when those things I consume on TV and whatnot, because obviously parallel to this, I discovered Late Night Show, which is like almost entirely American, and the jokes and the debates and the whole, the wedding cake, should a Christian have the right to deny a wedding cake to a gay couple? And my instinct to all of this was less, or my reaction was less about like, fuck that dumb religious person. It's more like, this is too complicated. Like if you are like literally like, if you are overthinking about who you're going to sell your cake, it feels like a waste of life. It just feels like a waste of time. Like there are other things you can do in life than something this dumb. Like that's how I would approach it, like even before getting to the ethical aspect of it. And part of how that kind of became part of me, I don't think it's the only reason. I think being autistic is part of it as well. But I just had this sympathetic character in mind, Susan and Susan, actually, yeah, in Friends, like, who was a lesbian, and of course still the butt of the joke, because literally Ross, or he gets divorced 3 times, and the first time she ended up being gay, and this is end up becoming part of the joke and whatnot. But still, in a weird way, kind of felt a bit emancipatory, in the sense that he, at some point, there is a scene where she tells him that her parents don't want to attend their marriage with Susan and her partner, whose name it's escaping me right now. And Ross tells her, like, fuck them, like, fuck your parents. If they don't understand your love or whatever, that's on them. It's their loss. And that made a lot of sense to me. The idea that just if someone else living the way they're living bothers you personally, I don't care. Like, that's not a legit reason to say that I have the right to actually stop them from being a gay couple or getting married gaily or whatever. Like, I just never quite understood the effort folks took, like these homophobes and whatnot took, to actively go out of their way, take time from their days to bother someone else and make someone else's life miserable and whatnot. That's a side that I never understood, and I was, as far as I can remember, I'm sure it started somewhere, but I just can't remember. But I was always like very, very hostile towards. I never tolerated this. That's and part of it was those things I consumed growing up as well.
That's something I think that I find redeemable about Seinfeld, which is a lot of these tensions are internal, right? And I, as someone who loves analyzing myself, loves psychoanalyzing myself, loves whatever, as opposed to something like Family Guy, where it's always someone else that's the butt of the joke. It's Meg. Actually, it's deeply fucking problematic how they abuse Meg. But also, everyone else is the butt of the joke. And there's this idea that we can make fun of anything because everyone is a possible target. But one of my favorite episodes of Seinfeld is the one where George gets a massage from a man.
Yes.
And
he questions his sexuality.
No, it's this thing. He goes to Jerry's apartment, and Jerry's like, what's wrong? He's like, well, a man gave me a massage. He's like, yeah. And he was touching and rubbing. And he's like, yeah, that's what a massage is. And then he looks at Jerry's like, I think it moved, And it's just... I like that deep insecurity, and then Jerry telling him, "No, that's not the sign. No, it's only if it moves by direct contact." There's like internalized homophobia there, but it's really just an insecurity with oneself, and an unsureness and a self-deprecation and a whatever, which I think everyone should have more of. I really don't like confident people. This is why I think Friends for me was never something I could watch, because they're all just very confident. And there's a thing
not Chandler.
Yeah. Well, actually, no. Chandler is a classic example of someone who has like an inferiority complex wrapped in a superiority complex.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
There's like that. Yeah. I don't know. You can't be that sarcastic without like thinking you're right.
Yeah.
And again, that's why I don't like Jerry. I like George, because George is deeply, and early George, he later becomes fucked, but like he is damaged.
Later George is quite something.
Yeah, and I love his parents. His parents is so relatable to me. This is why I find my husband's, like my my husband's family, they're so nice. No one yells. There is not even like, get the chair, nothing.
Yeah.
It's just kind of nice.
Yeah.
But so that's the thing that I still hold close with Seinfeld. But I want to bring up one other point, because I think a lot of these discussions of art and artists and whatever is why I'm a bit okay with some of these accusatory tones. Like, I think we're talking about a similar article written by a black, I think, or a POC trans queer person, and they're quite angry about Friends. I'm fine with it, only because, again, that still is not my discussion. Like, I'm glad that's being had over there.
For sure, yeah.
But because it's really not on us. Like, we have so much other stuff to deal with. Then was it problematic or whatever? Like, the fact that now we see it, I think, is good. The fact that it's obvious to us now. That sort of conclusion that James Baldwin made, that Edward Said made, where it's like, we should be looking more into the Congolese. You know, Edward Said, his earliest, I think his PhD was on Joseph Conrad. You know, you read
darkness,
you read about the dude going into the forest, but you don't into the jungle, but not about the people in the jungle. Whereas we actually politically, socially have much more in common vis-a-vis empire and whatever. But an important thing, I grew up in this atmosphere knowing a stupid amount about American politics. You know,
ridiculous amount.
Ridiculous.
I actually think most of us, on average, know much more than Americans. I generally think that on average.
And so that's the interesting thing, and I know James Baldwin talks about this. Like, it's not that we know more about them than they know about us. We know more about them than they know about themselves.
Yeah.
Right? And so, but then what happened for me when, like, the Thawra broke out in Lebanon?
The revolution,
was not just with all the stuff that I'd learned from Jon Stewart and from watching American whatever, literally reading Time magazine, right? Because, again, it's in Seinfeld, it's in whatever, this is what you do. But also, like, Noam Chomsky and all this stuff, and it's just still very American-centric, is when the Thawra revolution broke out, and I'm there in the square, I realized I can't talk to my own people. Like, not just in terms of, like, I couldn't speak Arabic at the time. Like, my Arabic was actually very weak because, again, the real discussions were about Mitch McConnell, were about, like, the decentralization of whatever, the state level politics and the Koch brothers and whatever, Koch brothers, that I didn't know our politics. I literally didn't know our language. And that's a damn shame. But then that was this space where I was like, no, that's where I need to work on. And that's when I started learning Arabic more, like Lebanese colloquial, whatever. So I can actually engage with people at a local level and talk. But also learning our politics, knowing more about Periphery than about, Mitch McConnell, you know?
Fuck both of them.
Yeah, I know, fuck both of them. But again, like, why do I know so much about
jokes? For sure.
But then also the jokes. I know all the, tortoise jokes about Mitch McConnell and whatever. And I can do impersonations, but I didn't know any of the jokes that were being spread about Nabi Periphery. And so I think for me, that's an important thing. And so now I recommend, like, I spend more time trying to engage and understand my own context, my own genealogy, where I do come from. Because there isn't that track between, Seinfeld and then me and whatever. But there is a track of Lebanese comedy or Arab humor or Arab whatever. So now in my storytelling, when I write, I try very much so to write in a certain style that I see I come from. And that's why I'm very comfortable rambling, right? That's why I'm very comfortable jumping between story to story, because that's how I see that, like, a very Arab sensibility of storytelling, right? If you read even like 1001 Nights, that's a form of storytelling that, like, we sort of, I know this is a bit strange to say, but also how my uncle tells stories, with the intonation, with the fact that the story doesn't really have a strong moral. It just kind of goes. And I think Rabi Alamuddin writes this way. I haven't read any of his books, which I think I should. It's a bit hypocritical for me to say that I should, like, go back to my roots, and I haven't read literally a queer Lebanese writer who is, like, apparently writes in this style that I'm writing. And so, yeah, I think a part of it is like, I'm not, whenever anybody asks me like, what films should I watch? I never say like, oh, Woody Allen, you have to watch Annie Hall or whatever. It's, I do, and I know you do this in your podcast. I know you do this in person or whatever. I think that's a way of resolving some of these tensions, that I'm not perpetuating some of the things that I consumed, again, by nature of availability, by nature of accessibility and whatever.
Yeah, basically, it's also like just accepting or being okay with the fact, because this is part of it, right? And we have to slowly kind of wrap it up. Like being okay with the fact that something like Harry Potter, and the same thing as like with the Simpsons example you mentioned, like had its time and should have stopped then. Like literally had to have an end date. And the fact that she keeps on publishing these things, and it's so absurd, it becomes like a caricature of itself.
Yeah,
I just ignore it. I literally ignore the stuff that she's publishing because I see zero value in them, especially since she came out as this unbelievably obsessive person when it came with like obsessive transphobic person. All of this to say, I think it says a lot. I can kind of wrap it up on my side. Usually, as you know, I always ask guests to recommend 3 books or whatnot, but I forgot to ask you to do this. So maybe we can just recommend 3 stuff. Could be 3 Seinfeld episodes if you want, or 3 series, or 3 whatever. And by the way, I think you should watch The Good Place. I think you're going to enjoy it.
Is it the one in heaven?
Yeah. The good place is heaven, the bad place is hell. That's kind of the idea. But what was I saying? Yeah, okay. I think it's very interesting that through something like Seinfeld, we are able, like quite literally, I think we can have a 10 hours long episode in which we're coming in and out of talking about Seinfeld and then jumping from something else, and then still finding something from Seinfeld to talk about. And this, to their credit, does speak to good writing. It does speak to something of quality has been done here. And I'm not one to kind of completely dismiss that aspect because of the negative sides. On the author versus art thing, I do think, as I said, it's not entirely resolvable. And I think that's part of it. I don't think you can completely separate them. I think that's a myth, or I disagree with it. But I also think you can't completely mix them as well, especially when it becomes a cultural product. Because Harry Potter as a cultural product is so different than the 7 books that J.K. Rowling herself has written, and even so different than the 8 movies that were directed. For one, they were not even the same director. Some actors changed and whatnot. But so much time has passed that those of us who grew up with it, like I started reading the first 2 Harry Potters in French, and then I couldn't wait for the translation to come out. So I started reading them in English. And that was a huge part of how my English became quite good. And I was that kid, that teenager who went to Virgin Megastore at like 8 a.m. or when the fuck they opened to get the first copy, and so I was that. I read the book, the 5th book, I think, in like 20 hours sitting straight. Like I didn't move other than to go to the toilet, and this kinds of binge reading and being really into something, I do think is valuable. And in a very complicated way, it's this additional, I'm not trans, so it's not as personal in that sense, but I can feel almost the hurt that a trans person who read Harry Potter growing up and is really into it and whatnot then sees how alienating that can be, right? So anyway, all of this to say that those tensions, I try and keep them to the extent that I find them useful. At some point, if you're just keeping it for decades, it ends up being hurtful. But just to the extent that okay, there is a tension. I want to recognize that there is a tension. What can I do about it now? Rather than, instead of just saying fuck it and I'm just gonna hate it or whatever, which again is a completely legit thing to do. I don't think any The Office, no one is owed in the sense that The Office doesn't owe anyone their attention, or the other way around. You know what I mean? But no one has to watch Friends. No one has to like Harry Potter. None of this matters in that sense. It's just that, some other thing you can consume if you want. But it's just interesting that certain people who end up becoming very different people are really into the same thing. Star Trek, I'm a Trekkie. I'm obsessive about Star Trek. But at the same time, there are horrific pieces of shit who are really into Star Trek. And I can't just deny that. I can't just say, oh, no, they're not real Trekkies. That's the whole no true Scotsman thing. No, they are, clearly. But fuck them still. It's not, those things exist at the same time. Anyway, I'm gonna stop now. Give us your final thoughts, and if you have some recommendations, shoot them. Otherwise, it's fine.
Yeah, I think actually The Simpsons is a good thing to sort of finish on in terms of talking about cultural empire and capitalism, and because it's on the 30th season now, and it's the kind of thing where, you know how there's this saying, I think it's either Jameson or something, of it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can also say the same about The Simpsons. Like, when is The Simpsons going to end? It can just keep going on infinitely in terms of like capitalist production. Like, if it keeps making money, you know, it can just keep going on and on and on and on. There's no like natural end. I'm really upset because every time I listen to one of your episodes, I hear those recommendations, and I think, what can I recommend? And so I completely forgot to like actually sit down and.
I mean, we to be clear, we're recording this on what is today, January 29th on Sunday at like, I don't know, 3 p.m. whatever, and I came up with this about 24 hours ago.
Yeah, and I just woke up. So okay, in terms of film or TV, I would really recommend. So the first season of Rami was huge for me, right? The second season was a bit problematic, but I think the first season had so many interesting things that...
I haven't seen it yet, actually. I will eventually.
I recommend... The first season is just... It was great. It was fantastic. It dealt with so many things that I was just like... unabashedly, like did it in such ways where it wasn't this like co-opted whatever or defanged. There's also the film Wajib, which I rewatched, by Annemarie Jacir, Palestinian filmmaker, which... I just hold so close to me. It's genuinely one of my favorite films.
Is that the one we watched? No, that's not the one, right?
Yeah.
That's the one. Yeah, that's a really good film.
It's fantastic. I love it. And it deals with so many of these things in such interesting new ways. Anyway, so in terms of books, though, I'm going to try and keep it short. I'm actually not much of a reader, but the things that I do have, I hold very close. I think... Of the things that I mentioned, I think Edward Said's autobiography, Out of Place, is actually was really transformative for me. And I was reading it in a very important time in my life because of these distinctions that we're talking about so much. I mean, even it's embedded in his name, Edward Said. But
Joey Ayoub, Habibi.
Joey Ayoub, yeah, exactly. Joey Hussein Ayoub, yeah.
Joey Hussein Ayoub,
yeah. I really love Guapa by Salim Haddad. I thought that was one of the first books for me that was very much so like where I was at plus 5 years in terms of my issues of having grown up with this language, with this exposure, with this representation, but then realizing whatever. And so I really felt so seen by that book, and just openly gay and openly whatever. And openly aware of this like conflict of mental colonization in an Arab space. Another one, Beer in the Snooker Club by Wagia Ghali, is like a treasure that I recommend to everybody. It's written in the 50s. It's set during the Suez Crisis, and again, to me, and written in English. And so again, has these elements within it that's I just find so fascinating. And my last recommendation, only because I'm reading a lot of her now, is Fatima al-Marnisi. I'm reading a book of hers called Shahrazad Goes West. And it deals with this concepts of sort of having had grown up in a harem, and then going to the West as a writer, as an author, and being asked about it by white men journalists who smile when, oh, you actually grew up in a harem? And she writes this whole book about why were they smiling? What is the harem in their mind? And then who is and then obviously dealing with this idea of the Shahrazad in their mind, and that the depictions of Shahrazad, you know, and that Shahrazad in American TV and films is like a sexy physical figure, whereas actually the Shahrazad, as she exists in Arab literature and in like Sawana literature, is a talker, is an intellectual person, is a person who uses words and stories to subvert the male hegemonic, literally femicidal regime. You know, this is the myth. of the Thousand Nights, that she saves all Muslim women with her mind.
Mm-hmm.
But the West, certain depictions of her don't see that. Anyway, I love it. It's been an amazing read, and I just love her style and how accessible it is, and how she weaves like her own experience and her own thoughts in this academic piece. But it's really great, and I just really appreciate it. And it has been my way of also like getting into this genealogy that I was talking about of like our writers, and you know, as a Moroccan writer, there's like it's a bit whatever, but anyway. So those are my recommendations. I really hope that 5 minutes after this, I don't immediately think like, shit, I should have mentioned that.
Oh, this always happens.
Can I edit? Can I?
Just if I send me the names, I'll put them in the show notes. Yeah, it's fine.
Can you ADR it?
Yes.
Just like,
yes.
Yeah,
let me say a few things. There is a book called Comedy Against Work, Utopian Longing in Dystopian Times by Madeleine Lane McKinley. So I haven't read it yet, but I am currently finishing an episode that I'm assuming she was invited on the podcast Seriously Wrong. I'll put this in the show notes. And the title is called Comedy Against Work, and she's the main guest. And the podcast as a series, I would just highly recommend it. It's a fantastic podcast. Mm-hmm. But that episode, it's part of why we're doing this now. Like, she was talking so much about The Office, and that led me down like this rabbit hole of thinking about Seinfeld and other stuff as well. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I'll mention that Salim is a friend of the pod, in the sense, Salim Haddad, like he's been here, he's been on twice. The first time was to talk about Guapa, or the second time. I don't remember which one. I think second time, actually. So folks can check that out if they want. And last thing is, I'm also getting into the Shahrazad Goes West. Yeah, made me think of the recent trend, like in the past decade or so, of rewriting ancient stories. And I've just finished reading Circe or Circe by Madeline Miller, a retelling of Circe, who's like a Greek nymph, a witch, whatever. A fascinating book, kind of basically from her perspective, like in that sense. Madeline Miller wrote the Song of Achilles, which is more famous, I think. But I love these retelling of old myths and ancient histories and whatnot in ways that are not just very interesting creatively, but in a way that also makes there is like an internal coherence to them, in the sense that it actually makes sense that Circe, who is talked about by, let's say, in the Homeric poems or whatever, that this is actually what is going through her mind, because a lot of these female characters obviously are written by men or talked about by men at the time before they were written and then collected and whatnot. And because of that, there are lots of things that you miss. Mm-hmm. And the last thing I would recommend as well is there's a podcast called Let's Talk About Myths, Baby, which is an amazing podcast. I was going to do a collab with her at some point, but we kind of lost track. So maybe I'll pick it up at some point. And also retelling these things. And she has this amazing series on Atlantis and the myth of Atlantis, and how it's never even been a myth. It's actually a conspiracy theory that gets popped up, and it's intersected with white supremacy. Like, it's a fascinating series. And she what's the other thing I'm thinking of? She has a thing for Assassin's Creed, which is just fun because there's one on ancient Greece. But yeah, and she talks a lot about, I think it's Medusa, if I'm not mistaken, of how Medusa is a misunderstood character in those stories, and how like there is no evidence actually in those stories, the original stories, that she is anything bad whatsoever. Like, she literally, some guy says that she's horrible, and he decides he needs to go and kill her and whatever. So she talks a lot about that, which is fun. And the last thing, I know I said last thing, but there's a podcast called Witch Please, as in bitch please, but Witch Please. And that's the one about Harry Potter. It's a fascinating episode. Each episode is on a different theme. They have one on hauntology, which I use in my research, like as in the stuff that they mentioned, I used it. And they recently did an episode on Iran with the same two guests that I myself invited when I did the episode on Iran, which will be out at some point. So anyway, I'll mention all of this as kind of just to reinforce the idea that, or to emphasize that you can start from something that seems kind of random or not meaningful, even, like, oh, why are you talking about Friends? That's dumb, stuff like that. But you kind of take it elsewhere. And that, for me, it's a more interesting, even more empowering way of approaching it than just good, bad. And speaking of, that's why you should watch The Good Place. All Right. Okay. We'll end on that. Ayman, thanks a lot for doing this. This was super fun.
No, thank you for having me.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.